Oh, if anyone is wondering, no, I haven't made questions this time. So yeah, chat boxes. Ah, nice question. Nice question. Like start something. You can unmute and speak.
Hey, Vikas, right? Hello. Yeah, I'm Shankar. Uh, I
Hi,
mean, like, my
Shankar.
camera is. Are you able to hear me? Hello.
Yeah, yeah, you're
Yeah,
audible.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, my net is actually a bit slow. That's why I didn't turn on the camera. Uh, so the thing is that I want to ask you, what is the next thing? You work in ASML, right? So, what is after
Mhm.
extreme ultraviolet lithography? What's the next big thing? Like, is something going on there? Like, below 30.5 nanometers.
Ooh, you already know quite a bit about ASML. Are you
Yeah.
from our competitors? Are you planning to join our competitors or something?
Dude, I actually like lithography. Like it's super
Yeah,
genius,
yeah.
dude. I mean, you work there. It's super cool. Like okay, I mean, you're the first guy I know from ASML. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, indeed, Shankar, so it's great that you know about lithography. And also, yeah, I'm also thinking how much can I reveal? Of course, a lot of it is what will happen and a lot of it is other development. So it's not, and I'm also, to be honest, not aware of everything that goes on in ASML. So it's a very big company with lots and lots of departments and lots of people. I work just in one small department, and we have like a very narrow focus. But yeah, we are making great advancements in EUV, like you said. So 13.5 is currently being developed, but also within that there are a lot of things which are happening. And as you might know, like how lithography machines are used, so they are used to design computer chips, also RAM. And then when you have a chip, you have a feature size, right? You have the size of
Yeah.
transistors, the critical dimensions that you can do with lithography. That keeps on going down.
Yeah.
So currently, you may know that TSMC, for example, is one of our customers, and they are also one of the
Yeah.
biggest chip manufacturers.
Yeah.
They do a lot of chip manufacturing for AMD, for example. I think also for NVIDIA, and they already are doing 7 nanometer. But the next big thing is to go to 5 nanometer, similar for Samsung as well, and they will make use of EUV for it.
Uh,
So currently, I think EUV is still developing, so it's really not as big as we would like it to be. But I think over the next 5 to 10 years, it will become really big. And beyond EUV, I'm not so sure. Maybe there's already something in the pipeline, but I think it's too far for now because EUV itself is not that
okay.
mature yet. There are a lot
Okay.
of issues with it, yeah, and cost-wise and also production-wise.
Okay.
But
So
probably over the next 10 years or so, it becomes big.
just one more, just to clear the air, like this 7 nanometer as or 5 nanometer or so as marketed by the company is actually not 7 nanometers, right? It's just above
Yeah.
13.5, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Just
13.5 is like it's the wavelength of light used, but the 7 nanometer is really the critical dimension. So that's like really the smallest feature size. But indeed, it's
okay.
a marketing gimmick. I totally agree with you. Companies try to sell that saying, "Oh, everything is 7 nanometers," but that's not the case. Everything else is
Okay.
quite big. There's probably one small connection somewhere which is like 7 nanometers.
Okay.
But yeah, it gets a bit muddy there. You know what to say 7 nanometers, what to say five. But it
Okay.
is a well-known way to really talk about technology developments in the industry.
Okay.
So
Thank you, and
that's
nice
about
talking to you.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, same here.
And there is also one question in the chat box. You can take it.
Where do oh yeah, here. So I'm not used to this Meet interface. Let me see. Okay, yeah, indeed. Can you also tell us how you got PhD opportunity and how is that for me? I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't
Uh,
done a PhD.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, indeed. You just, but you are working, right, already? So you started right after your master's, I guess.
Yeah, I'm in a job currently right after master's.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did I get my PhD? Well, that's okay. I'll try to be a bit short here. So a little bit about myself. I think that's how so we had probably started the session. So yeah, let's do that. Maybe also Viraj, after me, yeah, you can also give a short introduction because to be honest, I didn't look you up yet, so I don't really know much apart from what we talked already. So maybe that's also nice. So yeah, I come from Haldwani. It's a small town in Uttarakhand. If you haven't heard about it, yeah, you might know about Nainital. It's a popular tourist destination just close to that. I joined ISER in 2009. And so we used to call ourselves Batch of 2009 because probably at that time, when you start from ISER, that used to be the way. And I was there till 2014. So during my final year, before that, during my third year, I got an opportunity to go for an internship in Germany. So that was the DARD scholarship. And I was in Dresden. So that's a city in the eastern part of Germany, where I worked at the Leibniz Institute for Solid State Research. So I was more into experimental physics then. And it was, I think, a 2 to 3 month internship. But we spent most of the time traveling around. So not much work was done. But it was a nice opportunity nevertheless. So we got to, at least I got to see what the research environment is like and how do things happen, at least in Germany. And that was really nice because it was, I got to meet a lot of different people and see how things work there, and also the kind of facilities that you can get if you do a PhD in Germany, for example. So I came back after that. So I had sort of an idea, maybe something to do in Europe for the future, but I was still not sure whether I would want to go for a PhD. So as the master's thesis came in, or the time for it came in, so during my 5th year, I joined Shell Technology Center in Bangalore. And they were at that time looking for master's students to do some internships. So I had some discussion with them, and then we agreed that I could do my master's thesis there. And during my time there, I got to know about a PhD program, which was a collaboration between Shell and, let's say, the Dutch science, or the science part of the Dutch government. So it was a jointly sponsored PhD program where they take some students from India, and then you get to do your PhDs here. And all the work that you do is also in consultation with Shell. So if you develop something new, Shell also gets some part of it. So it was more about renewable energy, for example. So Shell wants to explore more things there. They want to move away from oil and gas. And so that's how I got to know about the program. I applied for it. There was like a big selection process. So first at Shell, and then I had some interviews with various research groups in the Netherlands. And then, I gave my preference. So basically we had like, I think 4 or 5 options to select from. And Eindhoven was my second option or my third option, something like that. So then there was a matching process. So the groups that I interviewed with, they give like a series of rankings, then I give a series of ranking, and the way it matches, you get an interview, final interview. So I got an offer from Eindhoven, TU Eindhoven, that's Eindhoven University of Technology. And then I accepted a PhD position here. So it was really, I think for me, it was because of my experience at Shell during my master's internship that I got to know about this program. And also at that time, it was not really advertised that much. So it was a program which was only there for probably 4 or 5 years. I don't think it's there anymore. And that's how I started. So I started here in 2014, and PhDs in the Netherlands are a 4-year program. So I finished in 2018, and then I started at ASML in 2019.
Hi, Vikas. Ashwath here.
Hi.
Hi. So, what prompted you to leave your PhD and work for a company instead of pursuing a postdoc and then becoming a professor? What prompted you to?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. No, I didn't leave my PhD. I finished it. Within the agreed period of time. And so the PhDs here are a bit different in the sense that it's like a proper work contract. So you like sign it's like a job actually. So you get a salary, and then you also have a fixed duration. So in my case, it's 4 years, but you can also do extensions if your professor feels that there's still more time needed to finish the work. You can always go for that. But I managed to do it in 4 years. For me, I saw my PhD more like let's say a career growth, not so much as like that I have to stay in academia, because that's something, I think the mindset that we have, or at least I had, when I was in India at that time. Maybe today that's not the case, but I'm talking about back in 2013, 2014. But that's not so much in Europe in general, and also in the Netherlands, PhD is just like another degree. So people do MBAs, people do masters. You can also do PhDs, but that doesn't mean you have to stay in academia. So the group that I work with in ASML is mostly of PhDs. So they actually hire only PhDs there for certain reasons. And So it's a very it's sort of a prerequisite to be able to work in that kind of groups at ASML. So for some of the positions, they need people with masters. For some other things, they need other people. So for me, as I went through my PhD, I enjoyed the experience. I think it was a great learning opportunity for me, but I did not see myself continuing in academia. So I did not see a future for myself. Like, I keep on doing the same thing. So I stay. I did do a PhD in applied physics, but again, it was more academic work, so it was not very applied in the sense that you don't see that happening or it being translated into a real product, right? So it stays in the form of papers online, or it stays in your thesis, but it doesn't get used right away. Maybe in the future, but not at this point. And also, continuing in academia, for me, I thought it's a bit more struggle, because you have to, it's not easy. So you have to go for a postdoc, then maybe another one, and then go for a professorship, associate, assistant professor. I think that's where you start. And then, that's a constant, you have to keep writing grants, get funding, do those kind of things. So it's not like that, it's all easy for you. But if you are motivated enough, I think it's a great opportunity. And I know, for example, my professor was very motivated, and he was, at that time, he was already above 60, but he was still spending like, I think 3 to 4 hours every day writing proposals. And I didn't see myself doing that thing, at that age. I don't want to spend all my time writing proposals. So that combined with, just my interest. So I thought I want to try industry, and something which is much more applied than what I'm doing, where I see like my work actually being put to practical use. And that's what motivated me. So I started looking for jobs, and ASML is based in Eindhoven. So that was like a natural choice to apply. And they also really hire people, at least for some of the roles, they hire people who have PhDs. So then it's a very good connection also with your academic degree.
So also another question, do companies usually only employ people with PhDs in applied sciences, or let's say somebody's done a PhD in theoretical physics, like hardcore theoretical physics? And is there a...
No. I mean, it's not like that. So especially for, I can speak like from experience for ASML. I don't know about other companies, of course. So with ASML, it's highly unlikely that you've really done something which is similar to what we do at ASML before, because all of the technology is proprietary. So it's ASML IP. So it's not like you can work on a PhD project, which, is of direct use to ASML. So in that sense, they don't really look for a particular, let's say, a degree. So I know people who have had PhDs in mathematics, for example, astrophysics, also chemical engineering, and very different backgrounds. I think I know someone also from biostatistics or biomedical sciences. So it's really what they look for is not so much as to the contents of your degree, what you did, but it's the experience that you bring. So being a PhD for them means that you can handle problems very well. You know how to understand technical stuff. You can work with a group of people. You can lead investigations into problems that arise, and you can work under pressure, right? That's something that you learn very well during a PhD. So those kind of things are what they are looking for.
Okay.
Okay, so because you did a PhD and then went for a job, so basically both you and Viraj are going in a route that's not into academia. So Viraj, what is your reasoning for leaving the academia route?
Right. So I'll first tell a few points about myself. So I joined ICER in 2016. And at the start, I had this thing in mind that I want to do in string theory, in theoretical high energy physics. Most of the people have such stuff, I feel like, because they come by reading some pop science books, and they have that feeling that we'll go and do this tough things. But as I went on doing my courses, I realized that curiosity was kind of an emotional curiosity for me. And as I went forward, I found that intellectually not so motivating for myself, to pursue theoretical physics further. So I started doing projects in experimental physics as well. So I joined Saurabh Dubey sir's lab. Then I joined Sunil Nair sir's lab for doing condensed matter physics and stuff. But there itself, and fourth year or stuff like that, I realized that by doing some research projects itself, I realized PhD it won't be I won't be intended to do a PhD further, and would like to have a job security and a stable life. And in fifth year, I started working at Triple IT Hyderabad for my master's thesis. Before that itself, I had started preparing on my own, doing some machine learning and Python coding stuff online. That's how I built up my prerequisites. And there was this advertisement from Triple IT Hyderabad where they needed research interns for machine learning plus science-based research projects. So I tend to fit well in those roles, and I was recruited over there. So I completed my master's thesis, and while doing the master's thesis itself, I started applying on various job portals and placed a job for myself. So the motivation was that in fourth year itself, I realized that academia is not a thing which I want to take it further. I want to have a stable lifestyle where I would have a job security and a stable pay, and that's why I decided not to go further with it.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah,
Yes,
hi,
Shantanu, you're
Shantanu.
audible.
Yeah. This is Shantanu here. I have a question. Like, how late is too late to decide what you want to do?
I don't think it's anytime too late. The moment you realize that you want to do something, you can consider itself as the right moment and start preparing. Don't ever think that you're too late and it's a waste of time to build skills from now on. So yeah, that's what I'll say.
So, like, till the moment we realize what we want to do,
Yeah, I realized.
before th-
Yeah.
like before that, what should be like our approach towards what we do?
Yeah. So first of all, I had this dilemma about industry versus academia, right? So I started doing research projects. For each semester, I joined a lab and started doing projects. So you'll get a feeling of how research is done, and you'll get a hang of what your life would be in a PhD. I used to discuss with senior lab members as well who are already doing their PhD. And from there itself, I realized that those conditions, if those conditions are there in my life, then I will regret that basically. So I basically found it the hard way by doing some research projects. So I will recommend doing some research projects as you are in as early as possible in your ICER stay, so that you will get a hang of how research is done and know if you fit in that role.
One more question to both of you. Like, if at some point of your like even you might have thought like, what should I do? Have you ever considered like about a complete flip from what you're doing right now, like doing something different, like totally different from what you're supposed to do when you're in ISL, like in academia, like you both are doing something which is kind of non-academic. So like, what motivated to you, both of you, to do that?
Okay, so about my motivation, as I said earlier, for each of the lifestyle, you need to talk to some people who are already working in that area and get to know their lifestyle. And like you need to have that instinct, and you will get the feeling that whether if you are in that position, will you be comfortable doing that job or doing that stuff. So for myself, I realized that I won't be able to continue being in academia for a lifetime, and that's why I started developing other skills which would help me in industry. So talking to seniors and doing some research projects will help you know those things.
Yeah, I mean, to add to that a bit, so at least from my experience, I can only talk about what I did, and I can tell you this was not at all planned. So I never really had a plan for a PhD. I never thought that I would. To be honest, I didn't even know about ASML before, let's say, towards the end of my PhD is when I got to know about ASML. So it's like I was completely unaware of it, and yeah, at least from my point of view, what I can tell you is it's very difficult to really plan, like what you would be doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It can really depend on the situation, as opportunities come by. But what you should try to do is like just use the opportunities that you have now. So like if you are thinking about, like Viral said, right? So if you're thinking about you want to do something in academia, or whether you're fit for it, just try looking for some projects, or join a lab like for one semester, maybe credit it or don't credit it. I don't know if they let you do that now, but I remember back in the day you could just join without any credits. Doesn't need to be a full-blown project, but just learn some stuff, see if you like the culture there, or look for internship opportunities in something else. So if you want to, for example, join a company, or you're thinking about that after your master's, look for opportunities during your to do your master's thesis in a company. That could be a nice way. Of course, you'll still be an intern, but you get to see other people around you, right? So you see what the culture is like, what other things they do, and whether you like it or not is something that you decide at that point. So if something nice comes up, let's say a PhD opportunity at just saying, yeah, MIT, for example, right? MIT Media Labs. Oh, that's amazing. And I want to do that. Even though you were not interested in doing a PhD, but if that sounds great, then you can always go for it. And it doesn't have to be in the US or Europe, even in India, like you see something that is, building up something new and exciting, a new, project that you think you could be interested, you could always start with it. And if you don't like it, you can leave it. But it's very hard to like really I think know from beforehand. At least for me, like it has been a process of discovery. So right now I'm doing this, I like it, but I can tell you that I don't see myself doing this for the next 5 years. So I don't think I'll be like at ASML. I'm getting more into blockchain technologies now. I've been following that over the last many years. So that's where I plan to switch at some point of time, where I'm comfortable enough. I'm doing a lot of programming these days. So I never really developed software, like, let's say from an engineering point of view. So I just wrote my own stuff, but now I'm doing proper programming. I'm learning Julia. And then at some point I want to move into some application with, which uses Julia. So something like that. But that's really down the line. But I can't just leave my job right now because I need to pay my bills as well. And so I need to have something on the side so that my job keeps me, occupied with those things. But on the side, I'm also looking for other stuff. Maybe a few years down the line, I can make that switch. So that's you really have to think about it in that way. I think it's not an easy answer. It's for some people it is actually. I do know, of course, some people the day they joined, they said that we want to do research. They stuck to academia. They went for a PhD postdoc. That's great if you are one of those people. But if not, then it's also fine. I mean, it's not like your whole trajectory is like clear in front of you right from the day you join. And especially with IISER, like it's still new. It's a new place, a new institute, even after these many years. So not everything can be very clear. So I would say, don't worry about that too much. Just try to focus on the opportunities you have now and just keep exploring. If you just sit around doing nothing, then of course nothing's going to happen. So, and if you are waiting for something big, a nice opportunity down the line, but let's say that's supposed to happen next year, don't just sit around waiting for it. Do something else. Even if you don't like it, now this is something that you don't want to do. So that's, let's say, one option less. So makes your life a bit easier.
Thank you for your answers. I have one more question, like if you don't mind. Like you, both of you may know a lot of people who was with you, or like who are still with you, who has done something in scientific field, like have a scientific background to be in brief. So do you know anyone like who has switched completely from science to non-science field of a career, like something totally different, and he or she is still doing fine, like anything sort of like that, or like how they are doing after deciding to flip like this?
I don't know about first-hand connections from my end, at least, but I know that many of our alumni are even pursuing civil services. So I think that's like a flip to version from academia directly to government jobs and stuff. But like I don't have first-hand connections with them.
Yeah, also from my side, I think maybe what you're referring to is probably, what I'm thinking is something very different. Like someone went on to become a stand-up comedian. I think that is picking up a lot these days in India, or maybe they're doing like movie making on YouTube, join the TVF studio or something. I really don't know anyone who did that. Civil services is a great example. That's like completely different, let's say, from a career trajectory point of view. And a lot of people from my batch also I know have been doing that. But apart from that, not really that I know of. It's also something that is a bit uncommon. You could, of course, pursue something in music as well if you're good at it, or you could become a stand-up comic. But to make it into a career, you really need to be good at it. You really need to be in the top, 1 to 5% if you want to make it a successful career line. You could do it on the side. I think some people still do some other things as hobbies, but I am not aware if anyone pursues those kind of things as a full-time career yet.
Like for example, consider some a job in management, like in some company, like doing going for something like IIM after completing my master's here, and like
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah. Actually, you're right. Now that you mention, indeed, I do know some people who went on to do their MBAs, and also, yeah, that's true. That's indeed possible. I think some people went for CAT, or I know of at least one or two who went to this place, Indian School of Business, ISB. So indeed, that's also a trajectory which some people have taken. You're absolutely right. Not many, but I do know a few at least from my batch.
Like some of my friends are also preparing for CAT. So I think one of them is here, Rishabh Singhal. So he's preparing for CAT. There is one more guy called Ashish Ranjan. And one of my friends is also preparing for civil services, Gaurav. So he's in 5th year itself right now. He's also preparing for UPSC.
So I have a doubt about the PhD program in the Netherlands. So you said like, so I've read about it before that they have employment contracts and that you're treated like an employee. So does that
Yeah.
mean that you get to decide what you're working on, or is there already a project or an idea that the professor wants you to work on? Like they have things ready or a plan that they would like you.
Yeah. So the way it works is, at least in most cases, the way it works is, so first of all, the professor or the group who is like planning to hire a student has to secure the funding to be able to support a student, and that includes like paying a salary to the student over the course of 4 years, plus also accounting for travel expenses, conferences, those kind of things. So to get that, they need to write a proposal. So in my case, for example, we had a proposal that this is the idea of the project, this is what we would do, and this is what the output would be. So I worked, for example, on organic photovoltaics, so organic solar cells, and what we did was a lot of simulations on the physics of it, on how the material behaves, what kind of properties does it have. So those were outlined in the initial proposal, and that is used to secure funding, and that's what the initial idea is. But once you start, it's really up to you how you take your trajectory, because for me, I can tell you, like, I think I did only like 30% maybe of what was mentioned in the initial proposal, because that was written when you start with something and then you go ahead, then you hit a wall, then this will not work, and at some point you have to then correct your course, right? So you have to do something else. So we kept on switching between things, tried different new ideas, and so it became very different from the initial proposal. So that's indeed the case. Yeah, so also, it depends on the group, the professor as well. From what I've seen, most professors here are quite flexible in that sense. So they allow you to explore your ideas, and yeah, you should be. They want you to become an independent researcher, right? And part of it, or at least a big part of it, is to be able to make your own decisions regarding your project. And that's what they want to see in the end. So it's not so much about the papers. Of course, those are important, but those are not the only thing. But the end of 4 years, they want you to be able to think like an independent researcher, to be able to do your own research or write your own proposals if you want to pursue a career in academia or go elsewhere. But that's really about it. And then indeed, it's like a work contract. So you sign a contract with the university if it's funded by the university or with one of the funding agencies, and it's an employment contract. And there are labor laws around it, which means like you have 40-hour working weeks, so 8 hours per day. And you're not supposed to work more than that, even during your PhD. Of course, that doesn't happen because you're excited about your work, and things never work the first time you want them to. So you're sometimes working on weekends as well. But in general, your group doesn't expect you to work more than 8 hours a day, and definitely not on weekends, and take your vacation days and things like that. So, it's everything like a job with a fixed time period. You also pay taxes and stuff. You have to pay for insurance and those things. But that's how normally it's structured.
So how do they decide that this person is ready to finish his or her PhD, or like, yeah, you are ready for defending your thesis?
Yeah, what they do.
You are capable of independent research.
It's a good question. Yeah, it's not easy, let's say for everyone, but normally when you start your fourth year, they start to encourage you to or push you a bit to start writing your thesis. So you write like a nice thesis in the form of a book, and it really depends on the quality of your thesis. So for example, if you already have let's say 1 or 2 papers, that's good enough. Or I also know people who also got a PhD without any papers. So for them, it was like they wrote papers after they finished their PhD. So that can also happen. But they ask you to write a thesis, you start writing the chapters, and then you have discussions periodically with your supervisor. And then they think like, what's the content of your work, right? So have you done enough, or have you explored enough options? It doesn't matter if it didn't succeed, that's part of the story. But have you done enough to qualify yourself? So it's really their judgment. Then of course it's sent to a committee who judges like whether the quality is good enough. If they feel it's sufficient, then they say, okay, now you are ready. You can finish this thesis and apply for a defense, which itself is a whole process. But before that, it's analyzed by a committee. So, but it's really it's not written in stone somewhere that it should be like this or like that. It's not binary. So it's not like you should have 3 papers, otherwise you can't get a PhD. It's not like that.
Oh, so I guess there are a bunch of questions now in the chat box. People finally started typing stuff.
I have one more question. Sorry, before you look at it.
Oh,
If
sure.
you don't mind, if you don't mind.
Sure.
What criteria do they look at when you apply for PhD? I've read many blog posts and they say multiple things, but according to you, what do they look at when they select PhD candidates?
Yeah, that's not an easy one, because of course there are some things which are bit generic, but it really depends on the group and especially on the supervisor. So you have like one main professor who's called a promoter, but you also have co-supervisors. So you usually have like a small team of 2-3 people, and it's really up to them to decide what they are looking for. I have seen, for example, sometimes they look for special let's say they're doing something with, I'm just picking a random example, machine learning in physics, right? Training a machine learning algorithm to do energy optimization of a protein structure, whatever. So they are like looking for things. If you have done something with modeling and simulations before in your coursework, that could be something. Of course, you need to meet certain basic criteria. So it could be like, I know GRE is not very common, but some universities have, for example, that you should at least have a minimum GRE score of it's out of 340, I think, right? So 310, maybe 315, something like that. And you might have to give an exam for English as well, so TOEFL or IELTS. Those are some standard things. But apart from that, it's really up to the group that wants to hire you. So in my interview, for example, what they ask is like, what kind of courses did I do? And since the project was about modeling and simulations, so it was more computational physics, they asked if I had some experience there. And of course I did, because I did that during my master's thesis as well. I did some DFT studies and worked on this nudged elastic band technique. So it's it's a simulation technique that is used within that. So those kind of things. I did those work at Shell, and that was quite, let's say, had certain degree of overlap with the work that was expected. But apart from that, they look at, for example, the kind of courses that you have taken, and maybe ask you questions on that. You might have a paper or two. Some people already get papers during their masters or before their masters, so that can also help a lot, I believe. But that's a bit uncommon, at least back in the day. Maybe these days all students get a chance to write papers already. It really depends on the group. So apart from some like official criteria like GRE, TOEFL, and those things, grades are important, I would say. I wouldn't, these days I see like sometimes people say, oh, grades don't matter. You should have passion for this and that. And no, that is not true. I mean, grades do matter. And of course, that doesn't mean if you don't have good grades, so you cannot do anything. But if you have good grades, then it really helps. And that can also be something that they look at. But I've not really seen a very strict criteria on that you should have like a CGPA above 8 or something, or 9 to be hired as a PhD. But that's what they do. So they like really interview you, and sometimes the interviews can go up to like 2-3 rounds, and they want to also look at like your capabilities as a person, right? What are the soft skills? So are you able to communicate well? So are you able to ask questions? Because the culture here is very different, or at least it was very different from way back in my time. So my experience in IISER that we did not have that an open culture, to that extent. We are very free to ask questions or participate like very interactively. But here they really want you to do that, to take decisions on your own, to be able to communicate with people. So they look at those aspects as well. If you just stay silent during an interview, I don't think it will work in your favor. And also for me, that was a bit difficult because I'm quite an introvert as a personality, and also way back in 2014 that was also an issue for me. So I really had to develop ways to communicate with people, and the first few months were quite difficult because here it's like everyone interacts a lot with each other. So you learn that eventually, but that's also something they look for. So ultimately, I think it would depend really on the people. And a bunch of other things. Sometimes I would say it's also a bit of luck. I wouldn't count that out because it could be that they are really looking for a very unique, let's say, a part of a project which you have done, let's say, during your 4th year in an internship somewhere. So it's exactly the same thing and it hits in your CV, and then they're like, oh, you've worked on this. This is what we want to do during a PhD. That can also happen. So you can just try your best. Like try to have a complete CV. Try to bring in your experiences, highlight your work. Also make sure like you fulfill the official criteria, because ultimately you will work at a university, so you should fulfill their criteria. If they say you should have like GRE score of this, beyond this, then you should have it above that cutoff and those things. But apart from that, I don't really think there are any strict criteria. I don't know if I could answer it well, because it's not, I don't have a very, let's say, there's not one answer to it. It really depends on whom you talk to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand.
Okay, then I'll probably ask from the chat box itself. So this one is from Rishabh. It's directed towards Viraj, but I think it applies to both of you. How do you keep your sanity in high-paced corporate culture?
I will like him to please elaborate the question. I think I don't really get the question.
Rishabh, if you're there, you can talk. Oh, I guess he's not there. Yeah. I'll skip it. Okay, so the next few questions are from Bhushan. This is to Vikas. What will be the right choice for joining a company? Whether one should go for a PhD or an MS is sufficient? I'm guessing this is more oriented towards physics, because getting like this can't. Okay, fine. I'll let you answer it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. I mean, it's a bit difficult to answer, because it really depends on which company you're looking at and what kind of positions are you looking for, right? So and I think it also depends on your location. So for example, if you were to go to the US or in Europe, like I said, PhD doesn't imply that you have to continue with academia. So it's just another degree, which will also get you to different positions in a company. So many companies only hire PhDs for certain positions. So then after a PhD, you could also, join those companies or continue academia. It's up to you. So it really, it depends on what kind of positions you're looking at, and whether you are interested in going for a PhD. I think that also matters a lot, because it's quite a commitment. 4 years here. If you go to Germany, it's 3 years. US, I think, can take like anywhere from 5 to 7 years, depending where you are, which group, and many other things. So you have to be ready for that as well. If you are interested in that, you can think about going for a PhD if you're interested in the work, if you want to get the experience. Otherwise, you can start looking for jobs right after your master's. So that's also a perfectly fine thing. But it ultimately depends on what are the requirements. If the requirements is only a master, then you already have it, and then you can probably apply and see what happens.
Okay, so the next one is also from Bhushan. This one is for Viraj. Can you explain what was your MS thesis project?
Yeah. So basically, I was part of machine learning AI with healthcare, called abbreviated as HAI team at IIIT Hyderabad. So it was related to conditional molecule generation. So basically, I had to create deep learning models which could generate molecules having certain properties in them. So, in many biological, chemical tasks, you always need to have molecules with certain property values. Like there are property values called log P. Suppose you want to have certain molecular weight, certain TPSA values. So my project was related to that. So I had built language models and done some analysis, how effective the generation is, how it compares with other state-of-the-art models. Yeah, that was it. So being at IIIT Hyderabad and in that group also gave me an opportunity to collaborate with other people. So I collaborated with other PhDs, and I also had certain side projects during my master's thesis. So these were related to general deep learning domain, not related to healthcare. So one was related to visual question answering. One was related to infographics understanding. So you have these pamphlets that you get in fairs and stuff, right? In restaurants where you have a lot of graphics and some things written on it. So you need to build vision systems to comprehend those things. So I was doing some multiple projects side by side as well, which certainly helped me for getting into industry.
So the next one. Wait.
Tushar, I have a question. So, how
Yeah.
did your academic experience help you in finding your job? Am I audible?
Yeah. So basically, my work was mostly on computer vision systems. So building all pipelines related to vision in deep learning. And I was interested in that field itself. And actually, if you look at LinkedIn, there are many job opportunities. So after gaining some skills and getting one or two published papers, I immediately started putting out my resume onto LinkedIn on LinkedIn, and then I started applying to various companies on LinkedIn itself.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
We can take other questions in the chat box.
Okay, so the next one is from Cyan. I would like to hear both of your perspective on this. What kind of companies, for example, ASML, are flexible regarding providing job opportunities to students with a natural science background? Also, at any point, did you face competition from engineering graduates while applying to these positions?
Yeah, at least, yeah, from my experience, I think, again, it really matters which company you're talking about. And also, yeah, I think the location also matters, because I feel, at least back in the day in India, we did have like quite a bit of distinction between, people who have like a BTech, from an engineering background and from a science background. But here, at least from what I've seen, that, yeah, it's a bit blurry, the line between the two. So if you have a PhD, it doesn't, also if you like just do a physics PhD, right? And someone has a PhD, let's say in chemical engineering or mechanical engineering, but, end of the day, you can work in the same place with the same group and do the same kind of things. So it's, yeah, the distinction is not really there that you come from a science background or from an engineering background. So it's about how you use the skills that you learn during your work, right? So of course, engineers bring a different kind of mindset, so a more, problem solving attitude, and also like also doing really work which is a bit more applied. But also like people from natural sciences background bring their own set of knowledge, right? So a deep understanding of physics is of course very crucial, but there can be other things as well. So these things can matter, depending on the company. Companies like ASML, for example, I know it's not that different. So yeah, you just have a PhD, that is more than enough. Doesn't matter it's engineering or it's from the sciences. But I know, for example, that a lot of investment banks, right, they hire people who have a PhD in mathematics, for example, and can also come from very abstract mathematics and not like a very applied work. But they also like to hire PhDs from that or from astrophysics who have had experience with I actually remember at Shell when I did my internship there, we had one person who was previously, I think, also teaching at BITS Goa, if I remember, but he had a PhD in astrophysics and did a lot of work there, but he then came and joined Shell. But what he brought to Shell at that point was his experience with analyzing big data. So he did a lot of data analysis, data crunching. And at Shell, they were looking for someone because they also generated a lot of data, terabytes of data every hour, I think, something like that, from sensors coming in from oil wells. So basically, they have sensors in an oil well and they are doing some, it's sensing like vibrations in the ground, I believe. And they want to do some seismic analysis on it. So they want someone who has done big data, data crunching, has experience with Fortran, Python. And then they hired this guy who had like a PhD in astrophysics. So completely different things, but you see an overlap there. You bring that skill set, and then you can be hired. So it's really looking for those kind of opportunities, I believe. Depends on the company, of course, and also on the positions. But I think most multinational companies these days really value PhDs, and it's also not so much about your work, but also the experience that you bring. That you have done a PhD now, so you are accustomed to like dealing with pressure, right? You know how to write papers, so you can write good technical documents, you can explain stuff to people. That also are the skills which companies look for. And if you have a PhD, then you already have that, no matter if you come from natural sciences or from engineering backgrounds.
I have a question. What actually the computational physicists do? Means only they run in stimulations and so how the things will work or what?
Computational, yeah, depends. Computational physicist, of course, is like it's not really the job title. Let's say it's a way to maybe explain, your the things that you did during your PhD. But for example, if you are a computational physicist, you are expected to have a good background and the understanding of softwares, for example, or understanding or writing good code, for example, or also some understanding of mathematical algorithms, right? Those kind of things. So in my case, for example, I work in the metrology department, and what we do is build software for the machines that we also build. So the software, for example, has many models, which does a lot of things, a lot of calibrations in the machine, and they use some kind of mathematical techniques. And if you come from a computational physics background, you're likely to have explored those techniques before. So some kind of minimization techniques, for example, or diagonalization or those kind of things. So that's what you bring to the table for a company like ASML. But for example, if you are a computational physicist and you go to a bank, which I know some people have done, so ABN AMRO or Rabobank, I know are some big banks who hire, they will look for like your experience in programming, or you have done some kind of numerical analysis, and they use those kind of models in their prediction. Or they also do a lot of like I don't know, everyone does machine learning, like I see, but they also advertise that. So they do some kind of credit risk analysis where you can bring in your expertise of machine learning and those kind of things. So I think it really is dependent on the position that you apply to, and then if you see something that is an overlap, it's for computational physicists, it will be these kind of things. So at least some experience with mathematical algorithms or code, or development of software, and physics, of course, and mathematics as well.
Another question. Has it ever happened your ideas has clashed with another student or another competitor?
You mean within a company, or like just in general?
Just in general.
I think, yeah, I mean, that happens all the time, right? If we all had the same idea, then I don't know, we wouldn't be able to make any progress at all. So it happens, of course. I mean, yeah, also outside your ideas don't match, that can happen. And also like during my PhD, my ideas did not match with what my professor thought. So that's also there, but that's part of the process, right? That's how you develop, let's say your experience as well. You learn to negotiate, right? You have to discuss it, you have to communicate it clearly, you have to understand why your supervisor thinks this will not work, and it's now your responsibility to also convince him. But he's also right? You need to have a backup plan. So if you're trying something new for 6 months and it doesn't work out, what is it that you're going to do after that? So then you have to think about a backup plan. Then you come to an agreement. So in academic environments, that's what can happen, and also in industry, of course, that happens. So in my group, we have other PhDs as well, and we routinely disagree. I think we disagree more often than we agree, but that's very much the way it should be. Otherwise, if you all just agree, then there's really nothing innovative happening. But the disagreement itself, there's a nice way to approach things. It's not like you become angry or you become frustrated, but then you resolve those disagreements, right? You try to understand what the other person is saying and what do they mean by it. Then you do an analysis and investigation, a review of your proposal versus their proposal. And in the end, even if it doesn't work out for you or your proposal doesn't get accepted, but you should be able to see a good reason for it. And if you do, that's just let's say part of the process. So to sum it up, you cannot always be right, and that's something you learn, and you learn to live with it.
Thank you.
So there is one question in the chat box that how many hours do you have to work, and is your work interesting? So what's your views on this? Like this question is for both of you.
Yeah, maybe I'll let Viraj go first on this one. I've been talking a lot.
Yeah, Viraj, you go.
Yeah. So I have to work around 7 hours daily, 7 to 8 hours daily, and as the question guy himself says, because I'm a new joinee, I of course find it very interesting, and I do feel like I'm in a comfortable position right now. I like the work that I'm doing. It's research oriented as well, so that aspect I like a lot about it. I have flexibility. My work is being used in production to help people, so that gives me a satisfaction about my work as well. Yeah.
So how's the environment at your workplace?
So currently I work at a startup, and at startups, it's very highly paced work. So there are always new products, deadlines to be coming into line. But the work culture is pretty chill, as that I look at some of my cousins who work as software engineers and stuff. They have a lot of work, but currently, because I'm in machine learning, deep learning side, the deadlines are not that strict. So I have the research freedom as well. So I can work on some ideas which I have for like 1 month or so. Even if there is not much improvement in the project, I can still work on my ideas. So people are very supportive in that manner.
Yeah, that's really cool. So like Bhushan has another question for Viraj. Like what other courses you chosen along with physics to complete the credit?
So because I was doing projects with Sunil Nair sir, I had taken few spectroscopy courses in chemistry. I had taken the data science course as well. So I regret not taking the data structures and algorithms course in mathematics. I should have taken that because it's like a foundation for computer programming. So yeah, if you are really gonna want to work in IT industry, I think it's better to take that course and be good at data structures and algorithms.
So another question from Bhushan's side for the Viraj. Like what kind of project or work are you doing currently?
So the startup I work with is a health tech AI startup. So I mostly work with MRI and X-ray data. So I have data. We have data from spine MRI, spine X-ray, chest X-ray, and the problems involve classification of abnormalities, detection of very minute abnormalities in the spine, segmentations, and so there are various problems related to computer vision. So that's the work I do.
Yeah, really nice. So like another question is from Garvit for Vikas. Like for PhD in Germany, is German language is necessary?
Well, not really. But the experience can be a bit different, let's say, depending on which country you are. So what I've experienced is, you might also hear this from many other people. So at least in France or Germany, they do expect you to learn the native language just so that you can also interact with people outside of work, right? So outside of the university, and English is not very common, especially if you leave the boundaries of university. Then you will really hardly find anyone, unless you're in a big city, let's say. Then it becomes a bit more common, but still it's difficult. And yeah, so that is not the case in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, English is like a second language, much like for us. We are very comfortable with it, and so do most people are here. So it would be very easy to integrate, for example, just by English itself. But of course, they also expect you to learn Dutch at some point if you want to also integrate with the society, right? So if you go visit your friends or their families, maybe, or just visit people who are not you're working with. France or Germany, I would say if you are planning to go for a PhD, then yeah, definitely give it an attempt to at least learn the language once you are there. They do have like courses where they teach you the language and stuff. So although everything that you do would be in English, but like I can tell you, when I was in Dresden during my internship, as soon as we left with the group for lunch, everyone started talking in German. So even if they know that I don't understand any of it, they expect me to learn. So they will not like put the effort of really translating everything to English. So it's yeah, I wouldn't say it's a bit rude or anything like that. It's just that they expect you to learn if you are there, that you start practicing German. So that's a way of them pushing you also to learn the language. And I remember I went to a bank, for example, to get some work done, and yeah, they couldn't find anyone who spoke English. So I had to wait like 30 minutes or so till they could find a translator, and then they explained like things. So these things can happen even in official places like a bank. But Netherlands, for example, is way more, let's say, relaxed in that sense. So English is fairly common. Also, with official stuff, you will always have people also switching to English as soon as they realize that you don't understand the language. So yeah, for PhD itself, it's not necessary. But if you want to live, let's say, or if you want to interact with people outside of work, I would suggest if you are in France or Germany, you do put in an effort to learn the language.
Yeah. So we can move on to the second question. So like second question is from Subrajit. While you were applying for semester project, do instructor expect to give some your own new ideas? I think this question is more related to the Viraj.
So basically, if this is your first project with the prof, I don't think they would expect you to put out your own ideas. But if you are mature enough, like you have studied the subject well enough and you have your own ideas, then they're always open to discuss the ideas with you, discuss how the project will progress and stuff. But it's not compulsory to have your own ideas.
So I have another question for both of you. Like, is this easy for you to manage your work life or personal life with your job?
I want to hear what Vikas says on this.
Yeah, I think that really depends on your situation, right? And also how you handle things as a person. So, and I do agree that your location also, I see a question about how many hours do you work? I think it also ties off somewhat with that question, because when I say it depends on your location, what I mean is like in Europe, especially, people place a lot of importance to work-life balance. So, for example, you're not really expected to work overtime. If you do that, it's not like you will have a positive impression. You actually appear to be giving a negative impression. So it means you're not able to manage your work properly. And regarding my hours, so I have like a fixed contract. So most contracts here are governed by a certain set of laws, and you can choose to have a certain hours per week kind of contract. So for me, it's the generic one, which is 40 hours a week, so 8 hours every day. I don't have to work anything more than that. So that's the thing. So I cannot actually by law. So that's the thing, and weekends are off. So I'm not expected to work on weekends or do anything like that. Some people also have shorter contracts, like 36 hours, 32 hours. So that can also be negotiated. But that's also really because the culture is like that. So I know a lot of colleagues who start quite early. I'm not really a morning person, so I start a bit late, but a lot of colleagues start quite early, 7:30 in the morning. And then they're like 3:30 or 4, they are off. They go to do other things, spend time with their family, take their kids to the park, go to the gym, whatever. So people have, and if, for example, you schedule a meeting at 4:30 with them, they will not really attend the meeting. They will say that I leave at 3:45, so I can't. So you have to reschedule the meeting. But it's like that. So it's a lot of emphasis that is placed on doing these things. And if you start to work more than 40 hours, you'll have some discussion with your manager who will say, why are you working more than 40 hours? And at some point it happened that during my PhD, actually, not at this point, but I had some hours or vacation days left, which I was unable to use. And then I got an email from my sponsors. They were like, "Why don't you take your vacation hours? And we don't want you to work extra. So just go take these days off." And things like this, those can happen. So there's a lot of importance placed here to work-life balance. So it's really easy to do that. In most places, at least in the Netherlands, and also I know in France and Germany, and most of Europe. But I hear different stories about the US. So in the US, I know the culture is a bit different. It's a bit more competitive, and they also like to work really long hours. Also, I see our colleagues. So ASML also has offices in the US. So we see our colleagues in the US, for example, really pulling long work days. But we don't encourage that within our group and within our department. So that can be something different. Is your work interesting? It is, yes. It is interesting. I like it. But of course, I don't think I will be doing the same thing, for years to come. So I also like to keep switching things, keep switching roles to try out some new things. And I'm also looking at things on the side. So I have my, side gigs happening. I'm just working on other things which I might pursue a career in when the time comes. So indeed, yeah, it's nice. I like it. I can make use of the skills that I learned during my PhD. I feel valued. I think that's really important. My opinions matter, and and also your group and your team really matters. So you could be at a great place in a great company, working on a great project, but be with a very shitty team, and then then it doesn't work out. You will not enjoy the work. So whom you work with, your colleagues, the team is very, very important, and I'm lucky to have a great set of people to work with. So that is about
So
that.
as a follow-up
Yes.
question, so are you taking
Yeah, I
another-
see it.
Okay, continue.
Yeah, I think I see it. Is it about the salary depend on the number of hours? Yes, indeed, it does. So it is proportional to the number of hours. So of course, if you work for less hours, you get lesser salary.
So as a follow-up question for the previous one, like what do you see as the most challenging aspect of your job?
Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I'll let Viraj start on this one. I'll think of something till then.
Yeah. So as I said earlier, I work with health-related data, and for that matter, our systems need to be very perfect in, taking out true positives from the data set. In the sense, if a person has really a disease or some abnormality, we need to have machines which are able to predict that at their best. So that's a very challenging task. And second task that is very challenging is our models need to be robust to the input, because these scans, they come from various sources, from US, from different countries. So they change a lot in terms of contrast, how they look and stuff. So building robust pipelines is also a challenging task at this moment right now.
Yeah, from my side, I would maybe go to a bit of a non-technical aspect. I think what I feel is challenging for me. So in my team, for example, we have a mix of people with different experience levels. So I've been here for about 3 years now, but we also have people who have been around for 20, 25 years. So really senior people. And sometimes there is a clash of also ideas and especially like methodologies to work, right? So we are pushing as a concrete example, right? So programming languages, everyone has their preference, but we have been using MATLAB for a while now. We are stuck with it. All our code base, most of it, let's say, is using MATLAB. Personally, I'm not that big a fan of MATLAB, so I prefer to use Julia. And now we are like bringing a lot of people to learn Julia and to explore Julia. So the people who are, let's say, of the same age group as you, they understand what you're trying to do, and they understand the benefits of learning a new language, and how it could streamline things and improve stuff within the department. But the people who have been doing that for like 20, 30 years, they really don't want to learn that. So they don't want to invest the time learning something new where they can simply use MATLAB. So it's those kind of things where you have to convince people who are way more senior than you to try something new. So I think it's the challenge is, I think, dealing with people. I wouldn't say the work is that challenging. Of course, it's just work, right? So things happen, and we deal with problems all the time, but that's part of the job. But to me, I think dealing with people is the more challenging aspect.
So a question from chat box for Vikas: are you planning to come back to India in future?
Ooh, tough question. Depends. I don't know. Yeah, I actually did not plan to stay here for long. I thought, okay, let's go for a PhD. Let's see how things are. And then I got a bit too comfortable. So I think as time goes by, the more years I spend here, I get more comfortable. Then it becomes even harder to think to go back. But maybe at some point I would eventually. So my family lives in India, of course, and then I would also like to be close to them. So it's really not easy, making a decision to stay out here. For now, I want to stay because of the things that I want to do and want to explore. Also, from a career point of view, is developing quite rapidly. Let's say in Europe compared to India, and so I think I have some opportunities there. And let's see. I don't know. I can't say how things would be in 5 years from now. If it becomes too boring, or if I'm too, let's say, homesick, I might think about packing up and coming back to India. But then I have to think about what to do. Will I be able to find a similar kind of, let's say, working environment in India? So that's always a challenge. But you never know. So I leave that question a bit open ended. I don't know.
So Viraj, are you planning to go out of India in future?
I think this one's for Viraj.
Yeah.
Not really as of now. I personally feel the startup culture is booming in India. So there are a lot more opportunities right now in India than going abroad just for job's sake. And if you are really concerned about the money that we get outside India, then many companies are actually promoting permanent work from home positions as well. So even staying in India, you can try working for a multinational company, having a position abroad instead of having it in India.
So you like to do work from home?
No, I'm basically more interested staying close to my family. And as I said, the startup culture in India is booming, and you'll get to do a lot of interesting work from scratch over here rather than working on already made up projects, and you will be just adding some functionality to it. Instead of doing that work, you will get a lot of work to do over here and learn a lot of things. So right now, in the near future, I'm not planning to go outside India.
Yeah, that's okay.
So,
Okay. Tushar, go.
wait, what's that? Huh. About work-life balance in India, do you think like the newer startups pay more attention to their employees having a better work-life balance than say something like Infosys?
Definitely. I feel like that. Like many people who work in MNCs, big MNCs, I feel like they are being they overwork basically, and to attract more talent, startups are uh, providing more perks, more flexible work lifestyle. And of course, I personally believe work life balance is in that person's hand, like how much they want to work. Like in startups, mostly nowadays they do not pressurize employees, like they do not have very strict deadlines, so you can easily maintain a good work life balance, I would say.
This one is from Garvat. I don't really understand it, but I'll ask you this. Can any of you comment on virtual reality? What is the future scope and opportunities?
I personally have no idea about the future opportunities.
Well, I'm not an expert there, but I do have some experience. So, of course, I cannot speak for all applications, but what I do, so I tried, like, for example, a Valve Index with a friend. So it's like a headset that you put on, and then you can be part of a virtual environment. So I tried, Google Earth, and that was amazing. I was simply blown away because, what you do is like now, so when you put on the headset, you see like the earth around you, everything, and then you can really like pin yourself to a location and actually start traveling in that location. So it's as if you're in the space, and that to me was amazing. And of course, you can use it to play games as well. But those are the things we can try. So it's really gaining a lot of steam now, and it's improving a lot. So Facebook makes their own headsets as well, the Oculus, and then HTC makes some HTC Vive and those things. So. There are opportunities there, but also like from an application point of view, for example, at ASML, what we did was we make use of certain headsets, for example, or it's at least in trial phase where we can, for example, connect with people. So let's say we have a machine at a remote location which is not working properly, and now we want them to be able to fix it. But let's say they don't understand exactly how to, so they can put on the headset. Then they connect with us here in here in Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and then we give them a virtual view of the machine. So, for example, we swap parts virtually, and then they are able to see how that corresponds to things in the real world. So those kind of things are possible applications which are being explored. But of course, you have applications in the field of medicine as well. If you can do like some kind of virtual consulting or those kind of things. And of course, games has always been there, so that's developing a lot. As the hardware grows more powerful and more smaller, you can have more kind of experiences like that. But the idea to also have virtual meetings, right? So you can put on a headset and you sit on a table and you have like your colleagues from different places around the world sitting with you doing those meetings. So I think it's developing. The hardware is not there yet, but as it becomes smaller and let's say more powerful and more affordable, I think the technology itself will develop a lot.
Shankar,
Yeah. So am I audible, right? I'm audible, right? Yeah. So to both of you, so like problems in industries is like obviously you'll have a deadline, and the thing is that suppose you are not interested in the project, or it's not challenging, or whatever, for whatever reasons you are not interested in the project, but obviously you have to work in the project. Okay. So in such situations, what happens when you don't meet the deadline and stuff like that? I mean, do you like doing the job, or does it feel like I shouldn't probably do this or something like that? Especially when when the deadlines cross, and when the deadlines are approaching, and stuff like that, because obviously during PhDs you do the work which obviously you chose, right? But here it's not like that. Here it's the company that decides, yeah, because we have to do the work on this project, and that's why the company has hired you, right? So that you can solve that problem. So how does it work together? I mean,
Yeah.
Let Viraj start on this one. Yeah, please go
No,
ahead.
I was going to say you start because I have joined a startup. It's been like 4 or 5 months only. I think you will have much more experience regarding this.
Yeah, again, it's one of those questions I think which really depends on where you are. I think the culture of the company then really comes into play. So I cannot speak for other companies. I can speak a bit for Shell, who is also in India, and I've been there as an intern, but I did see a very nice company culture. But also here at ASML, for example, you're right, there can be deadlines and you work on something and then you may not be able to beat the deadline, but that's really not on you. So you're always working as part of a team. So the team takes the responsibility. And for example, if you cannot meet the deadline, you make that aware beforehand. So that's perfectly okay. And At least the culture here is to be a bit, to be very open and be very honest. Many times I've been asked questions where I simply say, I don't know. No idea. How does this work? No idea. Yeah, I can figure it out, but I need a day or two. I can't just respond to you right now. So that those things can also happen. That's perfectly fine. So to be able to accept, that you cannot know everything. And the same goes for not meeting deadlines. So it's not like the boss comes in angrily, yeah, you didn't do it, or like the idea that we have about companies and corporate, and like they show maybe in movies or something. It's not like that. So you work as a team. The whole team is responsible for whatever the project is. You're never really working like all by yourself. But it's more it's more about how it's handled. And I think in most big European companies, I would say it is like that. So the culture is very productive, and yeah, they make you let's say they try to make you comfortable. And if you don't like your work, you can make that aware to your manager. You can of course say, I don't like it. I have done that in the past. I've said I don't like this. I would like to work on something else. And then of course you cannot switch the very next day, but they make sure that within a few weeks you start to work on something else. So those things can happen. But if you've started something, then it's expected that you finish it, right? Don't leave it midway, because then you promise someone that you would do something, and then you didn't finish it, and now they are like left hanging. But again, that depends on the company. I think for some companies it's more flexible, for some it's not. So it would really depend on where you end up working.
Okay.
Oh, I see a question about how much do you earn at your jobs? Ooh, that's yeah. I think we can discuss that maybe privately. If you're interested, you can always hit me up on LinkedIn. But in principle, I'm also not supposed to reveal that by law. That that's something to be. It's not publicly available. But what I would say is, I also see a journal. Maybe if that was not really the intention of the question, that's also generally fine. But we have these questions, right? Why do you want to go out of India? Or do you just go for the money? So I don't know how the perception is these days, but back in the day it used to be like, if you work outside you earn more money, you're suddenly rich or something. Probably that's a bit true in the US, I can say, because the salary scales are generally higher, but that's because also the cost of living is quite high. But in Europe that's not really true. So let's say I may get a certain salary here, but I also pay taxes proportionally. And in Netherlands, for example, the amount of taxes that you pay is quite high, because all that money is also used to build the infrastructure, which you can see is actually being done. And also like it's used to fund universities, labs and stuff like that. In Germany, for example, you might know all public universities are funded from the taxes. So you don't have to pay tuition fee if you are at one of the public universities. So it's sort of free for you if you are studying there. But that means the tax has to be high. So about like 30 to 40% of your salary goes into taxes. And then there are other things like you have to have insurance and this and that. So eventually you end up saving, I think, the same amount of money that you would do in India, or maybe even less, to be honest. So for example, in my case, I can tell you that if you work at Shell in India, you would probably have the same amount of, let's say, money as I would have here. So it's not really very different. You may earn more if you just look at the euro to rupee conversion, but when you deduct the taxes, the expenses, it's proportional. So if you spend like 20-25% of your salary on rent in India, or paying your EMIs, you do the same here as well. So it's not very different. But if you are thinking of coming to Europe, look for other reasons apart from money. Money is important, of course. It's not like that if you get paid nothing, you should still come. And that may be also dependent on your own situation, how it is. But don't think that you would eventually, become rich or anything, or you earn more money than what you would do in India. If you want to come to Europe, I'm not talking about the US, so that's a bit different, and I have no experience there. But for Europe, you should come for the opportunity itself, and you should stay for it. If you like it, if you like the work, if you like the environment, if you like the work culture, those kind of things. And then you can choose to stay or not. But you can earn equivalent amounts of money also in India, these days at least. And regarding the exact numbers, so we can just hit me up on LinkedIn. Maybe we chat one-on-one, so I can, then give you some idea there. But it also depends on how you live, and I would say it's good enough. So it's proportional to what you can do, the amount of work you can do, and you can live a comfortable life.
Okay, so guys, Viraj has to leave now. So I just want to tell you guys that.
Yeah, had a great time. Thanks for calling me.
Thank you, Viraj.
Yeah,
I know I gave you a lot of trouble with that.
no, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, okay. Bye, everyone. Bye, Vikas.
Nice meeting you, Viraj. Bye.
Yeah, same here. Bye.
Okay, let me see. Are there more questions? What extra opportunities are there in Europe that are not in India? Extra, I don't know. I mean, some things are definitely different. So, for example, at least you know how it was back in the day. PhD programs, for example, are way more structured in Europe. That's what I felt compared to what I saw in India. Of course, things are different now, so maybe it's way more improved. But for example, here you have a very clear idea of how to go with the project and like what are the expectations, and then you have a proper work contract. So I say it's much better funded here compared to what you would have in India. Of course, things are different now; they are changing. But to my knowledge, it's still not as comparable as what you would see in Europe. That doesn't mean good PhD work doesn't happen in India. It does. A lot of good work happens, but also it takes a lot more longer time. I know people who have had like PhDs for 7 8 years as well, and then they got married, they have kids, and they're still doing a PhD. So it can go long. But in Europe, like in Germany and France, I believe as well, it's done in 3 years. In Netherlands, it's 4 years. So you have like a fixed contract. It's not like you can keep on doing the same thing for that long. So that really helps. That makes keeps things in focus, and then you also finish on time. And also you get a decent salary for a PhD. So it's quite well funded. So you don't have to worry about your expenses, and you can like really manage things on your own. And then from an industrial point of view, yeah, that depends on what you're looking for, but there are some things which are happening quite well in Europe. So like the semiconductor industry, for example, is quite well developed here, but also a lot of things in the field of AI and machine learning. So a lot of new startups, but that also is happening in India. So it's not that you don't see it, but also like blockchain, right? So if you heard of cryptocurrencies, for example, you might see it in the news, Bitcoin climbed that high or Ethereum is that high or that low. So there are a lot of interesting things happening around the use of blockchain, not just for cryptocurrencies, but also for different applications. So it's cryptocurrency is just one part of it. It doesn't mean that the whole thing is centered around that. And I see a lot more of that happening in Europe in general compared to in India, and also a lot more open mindset towards like what those things can be used for. So that's something, if you are interested, you can definitely look. And then of course it's the work culture, right? So it's the work culture here, the companies, it's quite different from what you would find in a, let's say, a usual company in India. If you go to a nice, something like Shell, for example, has a very nice work culture, but I've heard from people from some other companies where the work culture is not great, and you end up like working 12 hours a day and also like getting calls at midnight or something. So that can also happen. So those are also differences which you might see. Do you miss ISER? I do miss it now. Suddenly brought back memories. I was looking at ISER Pune pictures and it looks amazing. I mean, I envy you, all of you, that you have such, although you're at home now, but in principle, you would have such a nice campus to visit. When I first went to ISER, we had just one building there, nothing else, not much of a campus actually. So I do miss it. Yeah, I think ISER was a great experience. I learned a lot of things. Of course, I made friends for life in ISER. That's always the case when you this part of your life. But also, the opportunities that you get, right? So that is really great. And at least during my time as well, we had a very different kind of environment. So a very different, let's say, from a traditional university. So if you go to a traditional university to do your BSMS, you have like the traditional curriculum and the traditional professors, but we had really people who came back to India from abroad. So they have a different kind of, let's say, work style, which is more influenced by a proper work-life balance. So at least I knew a lot of the professors, for example, don't expect you to like work till late or something, and they encourage you to like pursue your ideas. Or of course, the experience can vary, but we had a lot of such examples as well. And so as an example, I can tell you like 2009 is when I started. I believe like the first or the second semester, we had someone, Farhad Habib, I don't know, maybe he's not there at ISER anymore, I'm not sure. But he took a course on Python, right? So that was the first time I got exposed to Python. And I was like, why are we doing Python? We don't need it for our course. And like, I didn't really understand that much. And that I was quite naive. And, today when I look back at it, he was trying to do something which is so useful now, because if you start to pick up Python then. 2009, 2010, the next few years, data science became big and Python became even bigger. So he had that vision, right? So he saw the need to teach it to students at IISER, which you don't usually see at other places. So you have examples like those. So I hope they have like nice courses where you do, where they teach you programming or at least some kind of exposure to Python or other programming languages as well. But that could be, that is something different. At least that's what I felt about IISER back then. What is the situation? The pandemic there? Yeah, it's there. I mean, but yeah, it's also gradually reopening now. So the population has been vaccinated at least once, but there are infections also occurring every day. So there are some restrictions, but it's mostly open. I'm still working from home. I actually like working from home, so I hope stays this way. Do you have any fun non-academic memories of IISER? Oof, a lot. I mean, I can't talk about all of them, but indeed, right? So you make friends, right? You have nice, you make nice trips, and of course you make friends for life. So you do a lot of things inside campus, outside the campus. A lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff as well. So it's a healthy mix of everything. And indeed, I do have quite some memories. What is your work in blockchain system? Oh, my work, it's not my official work. It's something that I do on the side. So I'm also trying to understand how data flows between different kind of blockchain systems. So, and also like how to do analytics on blockchain data. So for example, how to retrieve information about the blocks in a blockchain and how to look for user IDs, how to look for flow of cryptocurrencies between different blocks and things like that. So basically analysis of the data, because blockchains can be quite big, quite complex. And then there is a big lack of such technologies right now. So if you can do something on that, that's also something nice to learn. I think it has a good future. The technology itself will mature and then you'll have nice applications. But yeah, that remains to be seen.
How can you explain how it has good future? I mean, it doesn't have any central systems and it moves. It keeps on moving or going by. It's an automated system basically. So can you explain me what is the future aspect of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so easy to sum it up like briefly. Of course, I can talk for hours about it, and it can be quite complex. But what I'll try to do is like maybe summarize it the way I see it. So, for example, you're right. So it's not all blockchains need to be decentralized. I think that's what you were referring to. There can be centralized systems as well, but you have decentralization. And the technology itself has quite some uses compared to only having cryptocurrency. So people are trading cryptocurrencies. You can make some money out of it. That's one option. You can trade, do stuff, send it to each other. So it can be used as a store of value. But the other thing is, for example, you can use it to make data more transparent. So you can use it to store medical records, for example. That is one use. Because one of the inherent powers of a blockchain system is that it keeps the data authentic and it's very hard to tamper with. And so when you have a true copy of a blockchain that is also shared by millions of users around the world. So if you just change a few, doesn't mean you can change all. So it becomes very difficult to attack a system like that. So that, for example, can be used to store data of a land record. Let's say you buy a land and that land has passed through different owners. So all that information can be on a blockchain, which you can access in a transparent manner. Or it can be used to store information about a product that you buy at the supermarket. So how do you trust that this product meets the certain safety requirements, or is it like a green product, or is it organic? So the history of this product can be stored on a blockchain. So that is something that you can do. And you can do it very transparently, which is not the case today. So your records, for example, today are with a central authority, and then you just trust them to maintain those records, right? But they can be tampered with and you will never know. But something like that cannot happen in a blockchain-based system. And yeah, if you are already not aware, also read up on smart contracts, which can be executed on a blockchain like Ethereum. And that is also an amazing, because what it does is you write a contract on a blockchain and then you cannot go back from it. So today, if you write a contract, you say to someone that, okay, you write me a song and I'll pay you this much money. But they write you a song, but you can never pay them the money. And if they start bringing up the contract, you can start, go to a court, the lawyer will file some loopholes in it, something can happen. But if you put the same thing on an Ethereum blockchain, the contract will be executed if you get the song. So you will pay the artist, certain amount of money for the song. That cannot be, let's say, it will not happen that the contract will not execute. You cannot go back from it. So those kind of things can also be done where smart contracts can be used. So I think the possibilities are immense. These are just a few. And this is something which is rapidly evolving, and maybe over the years you will see a lot of exciting stuff happening over it.
Yes, yeah.
So it looks like nobody has any more questions. I guess we can end the session
So
now.
I have one. I think I have one last question.
Yeah.
When you were doing your PhD in the Netherlands, so I've seen like to get a job in Germany, you have to know German. I think that's like a compulsory thing there. That you can do a PhD without knowing German, but to get a job, you should know German. So is that the condition in like most European countries, or are there? I think like in Ireland, English is used quite a bit. So like you can get a job without knowing Irish. So is there a lot of difference between the European countries there?
Yeah, indeed. That really varies on which country you are in. So indeed, I think it's depends on which company you go to. But in Germany, indeed, they expect you to know a certain level of German, and also if you go to France, for example, they expect you to know a bit of French, or at least up to a certain level. And that's really the country itself, and also the people and the mindset there. So I can tell you, like, also I know people who know English, for example, but they will still not, respond to you in English. They will just keep responding to you in French or German. So they can be a bit, or they may appear to be a bit arrogant in that sense. So that can happen. But depends on a company. If you go work for Amazon in Germany, then they don't really have it. They will say that, okay, you can learn it on the job, but maybe just a basic understanding is nice, because sometimes you might have to deal with some documents which are written in German, something like that. But in the Netherlands, it's not really a requirement. So like for ASML, our official language is English. So we just talk to each other with that. We do our work in that. But of course, sometimes you have colleagues two colleagues who are Dutch, right? So they talk to each other in Dutch. So that's, if you know Dutch, you will understand it. You can participate. If not, then you just, you don't. So it's more about inclusiveness. Then you feel a bit more included if you can. So my Dutch is not that great. To be honest, I didn't put in much effort to learn it. I should do it at some point. But for my work, at least, it doesn't bring any problems. And companies like ASML and also others, they don't really have that as a criteria. Actually, the criteria is that you should have a good command of English, because we have people from different nationalities. We are also working for people in the US and also in Asia. So English is like the common theme. In German? No, not really. I did my PhD here in the Netherlands, so there was no German for me. I did collaborate with a group who were based out of Germany for one of my papers, but we were just talking in English, so that is fine. But no, and also everything at the universities in the Netherlands happens in English. So then you write your thesis in English and everything around it. So there is really not much need to learn Dutch. But of course, if you want to interact with people outside socially and you want to be a bit more inclusive, you should try to learn the language.
I guess this question would make sense for some person who's done their PhD in Germany, because sometimes some journals, they have both English and German versions of the same paper. Like Angewandte
Could be indeed. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, indeed. I think that could happen. And also, I can tell you already that if you plan to go to Germany, they will probably put a course for you to learn German in the first semester, in the first year itself. So even if you don't want to, you will be given a course, and probably it's a good idea to do it. So maybe you don't become fluent, but at least you understand like basics of it. Especially when you go outside to a bank to open an account, or even like supermarket or something, it's highly unlikely they will speak in English with you, unless maybe you're in a big city like Berlin, for example, or Munich, Frankfurt. Otherwise, you just have to like speak a bit of German. So in that sense, I can imagine, being in Germany or France can be a bit difficult. Let's say it's a bit more open in the Netherlands in that sense.
Oh, so I know like the Nordic countries do not charge any kind of fees for PhD students, but like does Netherlands something like that?
No, not really. No. A PhD is like a funded program, right? So you actually you have a work contract, you get paid, and you're supposed to manage your expenses from that. So of course you have to pay your, but wherever you're staying, right, you have to pay your rent, you have to pay insurance and stuff like that. So those you manage from your salary. But other than that, there is nothing that you have to pay to the university. But if you are here coming here for a master's, which could also be an option, if you want to do another master's, that's also possible. Then you do have to pay a master's fee. That depends on which university you come to. But I know in Germany, for example, at least the big public universities, you don't have to pay tuition fees. So you do have to pay like a semester fee, an exam fee, things like those. But that's really very small. You don't have to pay the tuition fee. So in that sense, doing a master's in Germany is way cheaper compared to other European countries, and definitely compared to US. US is crazy expensive for masters.
Oh, yeah.
But then, yeah, if you have good reasons, of course, yeah, US has its own set of good reasons. If you want to go there, then that's also fine, I would say.
Did you choose Europe over US because of the time commitment for a PhD?
For me, yeah, actually, I think it was more like by the time I ended my master's, I sort of knew how capable I was. So I actually did not see myself capable enough to go to like, a top ranked university in the US. So that is really important as well if you are good enough for the place, right? Because US is very competitive, and I might get an option to go to MIT. And I would say, oh, I want to go there. But if I do not compete to the level expected that at MIT, then I wouldn't be able to survive there. So even if they offered me something, which they did not, but even if they did, I would have said no, because I don't think I can do what they tried to do. So for me, it was more like up to the level that I know myself, I can put in my commitment. I applied, and then I got a position here in Netherlands, so it seemed great also from a living point of view. And the university was also great. The project was nice, and I felt like I could do some nice work. But I know people, for example, who went to, like, let's say, even from a ranking point of view, a higher ranked university like an ETH Zurich, for example, in Switzerland, it's one of the top ranked universities, but the culture is also like very competitive. It's more US like, and I know they had quite some difficulties surviving there, let's say. So it can happen. So you really have to look at yourself and see how capable you are, and only then choose a place. And don't go so much for the rankings per se, but look at the department, look at the group, the work, and see if you find yourself capable enough to do it. It might be that you get an offer from a very top ranked university, but then it's also super competitive. And 6 months down the line, your mental health starts going down. So keep that in mind.
I guess there's one last question from Garvat.
US cheap for PhD students? I don't know. I mean, I think also the structure in the US is a bit different. I think you start like a teaching assistant or something, and then 1 or 2 years you also start to do your research, and then you do this. It's called like a qualification exam. Like you officially become a PhD candidate or a research associate, something like that. A research assistant, I believe, and then you switch over at that point. So I guess they are also paid decent salaries, but then it depends. It depends where you live, and like what kind of lifestyle do you want to live. So if you want to buy expensive cars, then I don't think you should be in academia anyway. But if you have like a standard lifestyle and you just want to live comfortably, I think you can do that in the US. But it really depends on the location and the place. Things are of course different between the two. And I think also, US PhDs can be a bit more, at least from my experience, my classmates, I know it can be, much more competitive. So then the workload is also quite high. And also they expect a large amount of output from you. So you have to be able to do those kind of things if you want to survive there. Life at ISER and life in PhD, what is the difference? It's for me also the difference came because I moved to a different location, right? So it's also the cultural difference that I see. But those are two different things. So life at ISER, you feel more like a student. You go to classes, you do you do assignments, you take exams in the end, those kind of things. But for PhD, that is not the case. So you feel more like an employee, let's say. So it's like my first proper job, so to say, the PhD. So we consider it a job here. So we say that's my first job. And it was for me also. I got a nice salary considering PhD standards, so that was nice. So I felt very empowered, very nice. And then it's like a job, so I'm learning on it as well. And Also for me, the location changed. So then that was quite different as well. So of course, those things are different. And since during masters or during your life at IISER, you mostly do coursework, right? So you are not really doing that many independent things. Maybe you took some projects in the lab, but apart from that, you follow the course, right? You can only choose a certain set of courses which are offered. But during a PhD, you're way more independent. You can choose to do things the way you like. And that's, I think, the biggest difference. And also then, of course, you're working for yourself. So during IISER, you say you get a degree, right? So you're working towards a degree, and then you're also doing that with the whole batch, so like 100 other people maybe. But in a PhD, you're on your own, so you're just doing it by yourself with your supervisors, and you get a PhD in the end. But it's then it becomes a journey of you like learning many things on the job. So I think you learn different things because you're also at a different point in your life. So during PhD, you learn to also like more take charge of your own project, deal with people, and also like travel around a bit, attend conferences. So you get to meet different people, collaborate in a work, talk to each other. So those kind of things happen more often in a PhD.
Yeah, I think it's probably time to for the session to end. We don't want to eat up too much of your weekend now.
No, it's fine. I really liked it, and I would say, I would thank you for having me here. And I think it's a great initiative what you're doing. This is something I missed from my time. We never really had such sessions. We also did not have that many alumni then, so you can imagine. But it's really great that you took this initiative, and I think I hope it helped at least to answer some questions, if not everything. But also, I'm available on LinkedIn. I don't use social media so much, so you won't find me on Facebook. A bit of Instagram here and there, but that's it for me. But I'm always there on LinkedIn. So I would, if you have questions, just reach me there, and I'll try to respond to you whenever I can. Also, if you have questions about the Netherlands, or if you're looking for PhD positions here, what to do, I'll be happy to help. But thanks a lot for this nice session. I enjoyed it, and I hope it helped you.
Yeah, thanks Vikas for taking out time for the alumni session. We really enjoyed this session. Thanks again. So one more thing, can we put your email ID on our website, ScienceWheel? So in case anyone want to contact you, so they can contact you on your email ID.
They could, but I don't check that email very often. So I would say if you share my LinkedIn profile, that's also okay. But sure, put it there. But I think LinkedIn is the best way to reach me, because I usually check it maybe once in a couple of days. Yeah. So then I think I'll be able to respond there much sooner.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Yeah.